Growing up, it didn't take long to realize my twin sister, Grace, was the favorite. From the way my parents spoke to her, doted on her, and celebrated her smallest achievements, it was painfully obvious. Grace wasn't especially brilliant or talented. Actually, she was kind of average. She coasted through school with CS and the occasional B, her ambitions limited to finding the next fun thing to do. Meanwhile, I worked my butt off, excelling in school, participating in every club and extracurricular, and winning awards left and right. Yet, in our parents' eyes, Grace could do no wrong. One year, I spent months preparing for the regional science fair, designing a project I was certain could win. And it did. I placed first, beating out competitors from across the state. I came home brimming with pride, trophy in hand, eager to share the news. My mom barely looked up from her phone. "That's nice, sweetie," she said, before turning to Grace. "Did you tell me Kevin called earlier? He's such a nice boy." Grace grinned, launching into a story about her latest crush. My dad chimed in enthusiastically, laughing at all the right moments. It was always like that. My achievements were acknowledged with a shrug, while Grace's mediocrity was celebrated as though she'd cured cancer. I told myself I didn't need their approval, that my success spoke for itself. But the resentment grew bit by bit, like water dripping steadily into a glass until it's ready to overflow. The divide became even more pronounced when we reached our 20s. By then, I was on the fast track to success. I'd earned a scholarship to a prestigious university and landed a job at a top firm straight out of college. My parents, though, were far more interested in Grace's love life. I'll never forget the day I told them I'd been promoted to senior analyst, a huge milestone in my career. My dad muttered a quick, "That's great," without looking up from his crossword puzzle, while my mom immediately shifted gears to gush about Grace's new part-time job at a boutique. "She's finally finding her footing," Mom said proudly, as though Grace had just climbed Mount Everest. "We're so proud of her." Later that week, they threw Grace a dinner party to celebrate her accomplishment. I sat at the table, picking at my food, as my parents toasted her success. They'd never done anything like that for me, not when I got into university, not when I graduated with honors, and certainly not for any of my promotions. I tried to keep my resentment in check, telling myself it wasn't worth the energy. But it wasn't easy. Watching Grace soak up their adoration while I was treated like an afterthought stung in a way I couldn't fully describe. By the time we were in our late 20s, I'd largely accepted the dynamics of our family. Grace was the golden child, and I was, well, just there. I still visited for holidays and birthdays, but my enthusiasm had waned. I learned to tune out their conversations about Grace's latest adventures and kept my own updates brief, knowing they didn't really care. And then came Grace's engagement. She'd been dating her boyfriend, Mark, for about a year when she announced the news. My parents were overjoyed, immediately diving into plans for a lavish wedding. At first, I didn't think much of it. Sure, they were going overboard, but that was their style when it came to Grace. It wasn't until I overheard a conversation between my mom and dad that I realized just how far they were willing to go. "It's only fair we use the fund for Grace," Mom said matter-of-factly. "What fund?" I asked, stepping into the kitchen. Mom jumped, clearly startled. "Oh, nothing. Just talking about wedding logistics." But I wasn't buying it. After some prodding, I discovered the truth. The wedding fund my late grandmother had set aside for both Grace and me, money meant to help us pay for our weddings, was being used entirely for Grace's. I was stunned. "That's supposed to be split between us," I said, my voice shaking. Mom waved a hand dismissively. "You're so busy with work, sweetie. It's not like you're planning a wedding anytime soon." Her casual tone only fueled my anger. "That's not the point. It's my inheritance, too. You don't get to just decide." "Grace needs it now," Dad interrupted firmly. "When the time comes, we'll figure something out for you." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My grandmother had made it clear the fund was for both of us, not just Grace. And yet, my parents had decided, without consulting me, to give it all to her. That night, as I lay in bed replaying the conversation, something inside me snapped. For years, I'd put up with their favoritism, telling myself it wasn't worth the fight. But this was different. They'd crossed a line I couldn't ignore, and I knew things would never be the same again. The wedding fund had always been a quiet reassurance in the back of my mind. It wasn't just money. It was my grandmother's way of making sure Grace and I had something tangible to start our adult lives with. She had made it explicitly clear in her will that the fund was to be split evenly between us for our weddings. Growing up, it was one of the few things that made me feel like we were on equal footing. After she passed, my parents became the stewards of the fund, a responsibility they took with little ceremony. I didn't think much about it, mostly because I wasn't even sure when or if I'd get married. I'd been too focused on my career to worry about relationships, and I assumed the money would just be there when I needed it. But then Grace got engaged. Her boyfriend, Mark, was nice enough, but their relationship had always struck me as impulsive. They'd been dating for just over a year when she announced the engagement, and while my parents were ecstatic, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease. Grace had always been quick to dive headfirst into things without thinking them through. The wedding plans spiraled out of control almost immediately. Within weeks, Grace was talking about a designer gown, an exclusive 5-star venue, custom floral arrangements, and a live band that charged more per hour than most people made in a week. It was the kind of wedding most people could only dream of, and I couldn't help but wonder how she was planning to afford it. Grace didn't have savings, her boutique job barely covered her rent, and Mark wasn't exactly loaded either. Yet, somehow, she seemed to have an unlimited budget for her dream day. One evening, I stopped by my parents' house to drop off some documents my mom had asked for. As I walked into the kitchen, I heard her voice drifting from the next room. She was on the phone, her tone hushed but animated. "It's only fair we use the fund for Grace," she said. "After all, she's actually getting married." I froze. My heart started pounding as her words sank in. When she hung up, I stepped into the room. "What fund are you talking about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. My mom jumped, startled by my sudden appearance. "Oh, just the wedding fund," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "You mean the fund that's supposed to be split between Grace and me?" I asked, my voice sharp. She hesitated, then let out a sigh. "Well, sweetie, you're so busy with work, and Grace needs it now. We thought you wouldn't mind." "You thought I wouldn't mind?" I repeated, disbelief and anger coursing through me. "It's not like you're planning a wedding anytime soon," she said casually, as if that justified it. "And Grace's wedding is going to be beautiful. You'll see." My dad walked in at that moment, glancing between us. "What's going on?" "She's upset about the fund," my mom said, exasperated. "I told her we'll figure something out when the time comes for her." I turned to him, hoping for some semblance of fairness. "Dad, this isn't right. That money was meant for both of us. You can't just give it all to Grace." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, I get that it's frustrating, but Grace is the one getting married right now. When you're ready, we'll work something out." It was like talking to a brick wall. They didn't care that they were breaking my grandmother's wishes. They didn't care that they were stealing from me. All that mattered was Grace. That night, I went home and tried to calm myself, but the anger wouldn't go away. This wasn't just about the money. It was about the years of being overlooked, dismissed, and treated as less important. The wedding fund was supposed to be the one thing that was fair, the one thing that couldn't be taken from me. But they had taken it, assuming I'd stay quiet, just like I always had. I realized then that this wasn't something I could forgive. They hadn't even asked me. They'd made the decision without a second thought, confident that I wouldn't fight back. For the first time, I saw my parents for what they truly were, selfish and unapologetically biased. And Grace? She hadn't even blinked. She knew exactly where the money was coming from, but it didn't matter to her. As far as she was concerned, she deserved it. I knew then that things would never be the same. Something had broken that night, and I wasn't sure it could ever be repaired. The day of Grace's wedding felt like walking into a meticulously curated nightmare. The venue was nothing short of extravagant, a sprawling estate with manicured gardens, crystal chandeliers, and cascading floral arrangements that probably cost more than my yearly rent. Guests were greeted by servers with trays of champagne, and a string quartet played softly in the background. Everything screamed luxury, and with every step I took, I could feel my anger bubbling beneath the surface. I debated not going. Every fiber of my being wanted to stay home, to avoid seeing the spectacle that had been funded by what was rightfully mine. But in the end, I went out of respect for my grandmother's memory. She had wanted us to share in this milestone, and part of me felt like I owed it to her to be there, even if it felt like a slap in the face. As I sat through the ceremony, watching Grace glide down the aisle in a gown that looked like it belonged on a magazine cover, I felt sick to my stomach. My parents beamed with pride, tears streaming down my mom's face, as if Grace had accomplished something monumental. They acted like nothing was wrong, like they hadn't stolen from me to make this day happen. Every detail, the extravagant decor, The custom aisle runner with their initials, the towering floral arch, was a glaring reminder of the fun they had taken without a second thought. At the reception, I did my best to keep my distance. I found a quiet corner near the back of the ballroom, nursing a glass of wine and avoiding small talk with distant relatives. But Grace, in true Grace fashion, sought me out. "Isn't it amazing?" she gushed, practically bouncing with excitement. She gestured to the grandiose decor, the live band playing upbeat jazz, and the gourmet buffet that looked like something out of a Michelin-starred restaurant. I couldn't have done it without Mom and Dad. Her words felt like a slap. "You mean without my wedding fund?" I said, my voice sharper than I intended. She rolled her eyes, her smile faltering for just a moment. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. You're not even dating anyone. It's not like you needed it." The audacity of her response left me speechless. For years, I'd tolerated her self-centered behavior, biting my tongue as she basked in the unearned adoration of our parents. But this was too much. "You don't get it, do you?" I said, my voice low but steady. "That money wasn't yours. It was meant for both of us. But, of course, in this family, Grace always comes first." She tilted her head, as if I were speaking another language. "Why are you making this such a big deal?" "It's just money." I stared at her, feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. "It's not just money, Grace. It's everything. And you don't even care." Without waiting for her response, I turned and walked away. I didn't say goodbye to my parents. I didn't wait for dessert or the bouquet toss. I left the reception early, my heart pounding with a mixture of rage and hurt. As I drove home, I made a decision that had been years in the making. I was done. For years, I had tolerated their blatant favoritism, their dismissive attitude toward me, and their endless excuses for Grace's behavior. I had convinced myself that it wasn't worth the fight, that I could rise above it. But this was unforgivable. They hadn't just ignored me. They had actively stolen from me, erasing my grandmother's wishes in the process. That night, I blocked Grace on every platform. I stopped answering my parents' calls and texts, and when they tried to visit me unannounced a week later, I didn't open the door. I was done being the invisible twin, the afterthought. They had made their choice, and now I was making mine. For the first time in my life, I chose myself. Cutting off my family was a leap into the unknown, both liberating and terrifying. For years, I had twisted myself into knots trying to win their approval, only to be met with indifference or dismissal. When I finally walked away, it felt like shedding a suffocating weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. For the first time, I wasn't explaining myself, tiptoeing around Grace's ego, or begging for scraps of validation. I threw myself into my career with renewed focus, determined to prove, to myself, not them, that I could build a life worth living. My efforts paid off. Within a year, I landed a major promotion, earning a reputation as one of the most reliable and innovative minds in my industry. I took up hobbies I'd always put on hold, like photography and hiking, and I made friends who became like a second family. Without the constant emotional drain of my family's drama, I found myself thriving in ways I never thought possible. But the freedom came at a cost. Holidays were the hardest. That first Thanksgiving, I sat alone in my apartment with takeout and a glass of wine, scrolling aimlessly through Netflix. I missed the idea of family, the warmth of shared traditions, the comfort of belonging. But every time I felt the pull to call them, I reminded myself of what they had done. How they had chosen Grace, again and again, without a second thought. Christmas wasn't any easier. I saw Grace's perfect life plastered all over social media, her lavish decorations, a mountain of presents under the tree, and a caption that read, "Family is everything Red Heart." It felt like a calculated jab, a reminder that she had everything I didn't. I shut my phone off and spent the day volunteering at a local shelter, finding solace in helping others rather than wallowing in what I'd lost. Even as I built a new life, there were moments when the ache of estrangement hit me unexpectedly. A colleague's offhand comment about their supportive parents, a wedding invitation that came with a plus family option, or even something as simple as seeing a father and daughter laughing together at a coffee shop. Those moments stung, but I reminded myself of why I had walked away. Grace, of course, didn't seem to care, or at least she pretended not to. She was too busy living her picture-perfect life, flaunting her extravagant vacations, designer handbags, and her enormous house on social media. Every post was carefully curated to project an image of perfection, and while it annoyed me, I couldn't help but feel grateful that I was no longer a part of her endless performance. Occasionally, though, she'd break her silence just enough to remind me of what I'd walked away from. Her texts were always the same, thinly veiled attempts at guilt-tripping me for not being involved in the family. "Mom made your favorite pie for Thanksgiving," she wrote one year. "It's not the same without you here." Or, "We all missed you at Dad's birthday. It's sad you don't want to be part of the family anymore." I never responded. What was there to say? Grace didn't miss me. She missed having someone to feel superior to, someone to shadow her golden glow. I wasn't playing that role anymore, and I wasn't going to let her pull me back into it. For years, I had been the invisible twin, the afterthought in my own family. Now, for the first time, I felt like I was living for myself. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was mine. Years passed without a word from my family. I had almost convinced myself I'd never hear from them again, and honestly, I was fine with that. Then, one ordinary evening, as I was unwinding after a long day at work, my phone buzzed. The name on the screen stopped me in my tracks. Mom. For a moment, I stared at the screen, debating whether to answer. My immediate instinct was to let it go to voicemail, but curiosity, and maybe a lingering thread of guilt, got the better of me. Against my better judgment, I swiped to accept the call. "Hellos," I said cautiously. There was a pause, then my mom's voice, trembling and hesitant. "We need to talk." She quickly launched into an explanation, her words tumbling over each other. My parents had been in a car accident, a bad one. My dad had suffered a broken leg and a fractured pelvis, while my mom was dealing with multiple rib fractures and a lengthy recovery process. Their insurance, she said, wasn't covering everything, and the medical bills were piling up fast. "We've tried everything," she said, her voice cracking. "But we're running out of options. Grace and Mark have helped as much as they can, but we need your help." The audacity of her request hit me like a slap. I sat there, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white, as a wave of disbelief washed over me. These were the same parents who had stolen my inheritance without a second thought, who had dismissed my accomplishments and made it abundantly clear that Grace was their priority. And now, they had the nerve to come crawling back, asking for my help? "Why are you calling me?" I asked, my voice cold. "Because you're our daughter," she replied, her tone laced with desperation. "We're family, and family helps family." I couldn't stop the bitter laugh that escaped me. "Family helps family? That's rich coming from you?" The conversation spiraled from there. My mom tried to appeal to my sense of obligation, bringing up memories of childhood moments I barely remembered, as if they were proof of some deep bond we'd shared. When that didn't work, she pivoted to guilt. "Your father isn't the same," she said, her voice breaking. "He's in so much pain, and we're doing everything we can, but it's not enough. Grace is stretched thin, and we don't know where else to turn." I could practically feel the bile rising in my throat. Grace was stretched thin? The same Grace who lived in a mansion, took luxury vacations, and flaunted her wealth on social media? They wanted me to believe she and her husband couldn't cover the bills, so now I was supposed to swoop in and save the day? "I'll think about it," I lied, just to get her off the phone. After we hung up, I sat in stunned silence, replaying the conversation in my mind. Part of me wanted to scream, to throw my phone across the room and let out years' worth of pent-up frustration. But another part of me, a smaller, quieter part, felt something else entirely. Regret. Not for cutting them off. I still believed I'd made the right choice. But regret for the fact that, despite everything, I couldn't shake the tiny sliver of guilt gnawing at the edges of my resolve. It didn't last long. As I thought about their audacity, their years of neglect, and the way they had taken from me without a second thought, that regret solidified into anger. They had made their bed. Now they could lie in it. It didn't take long after my mom's call for Grace to reach out. Her name popped up on my phone one evening while I was reviewing a project proposal. I almost ignored it, but decided to see what she had to say, curiosity outweighing my better judgment. "Hellos," I said, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. "Hey, sis." Grace chirped, her voice syrupy sweet. She didn't sound like someone making a casual call. Her tone was rehearsed, calculated. "How are you?" "It's been too long." "I'm busy," I replied flatly. "What do you want, Grace?" She let out a dramatic sigh, as though my lack of warmth had personally offended her. "I just thought we could talk. I know things haven't been great between us, but Mom and Dad really need us right now. Family helps family, you know." Her words hit a nerve, but I refused to let her see it. Funny, I said coldly. I don't remember them helping me when they stole my wedding fund. Grace's laugh was soft but hollow, like she couldn't believe I was still bringing that up. Oh, come on. You're still hung up on that? They were just trying to help me start my life. It wasn't personal. Not personals. My voice rose despite my best efforts to stay calm. It was my inheritance too, Grace. Money Grandma wanted us to share equally. But, of course, you deserved it more because you're Grace, the golden child. And now, after years of ignoring me, you're asking for my help? Give me a break. Grace sighed again, this time with an air of condescension, as if I were a stubborn child she had to reason with. You've always been the successful one, she said. You don't even need the money. You're doing fine on your own, and they were just trying to do what they thought was best. Can't you let it go? Her words were like gasoline on a fire, and my anger burned even brighter. If you and Mark are so well off, I said sharply, why don't you cover their bills? You've got the big house, the fancy vacations, the picture-perfect life. Surely you can manage. For a moment, Grace hesitated, and I could almost hear the gears turning in her head. We've done what we can, she said vaguely, quickly changing the subject. But this isn't about me. It's about Mom and Dad. They need us, and I can't do it alone. The irony of her words almost made me laugh. She couldn't do it alone? She and Mark had far more resources than I did, and yet she expected me to step in and shoulder the burden. It was classic Grace, painting herself as the helpless victim while subtly positioning me as the villain for refusing to comply. I'm sorry, Grace, I said, my voice laced with finality. I can't help. Wow, she said after a beat, her tone dripping with sarcasm. I guess I shouldn't be surprised. You've always been good at walking away. I ended the call without another word, my heart pounding with a mix of anger and satisfaction. Grace had always been a master manipulator, but this time, I wasn't falling for it. As I set my phone down, I felt a flicker of doubt creeping in. Part of me wondered if I was being too harsh, too rigid in my refusal to help. But then I thought about the years of favoritism, the wedding fund they had stolen, and the way they only seemed to care about me now that they needed something. No. I had made my decision, and I wasn't going to let Grace or anyone else guilt me into changing it. The next call from my parents came a week later. I knew it was coming. I could feel it looming after Grace's guilt trip failed to sway me. But that didn't make it any easier. When my phone lit up with my dad's name, I debated letting it ring out. But I knew they wouldn't stop until they got an answer, so I steeled myself and picked up. Hello, I said, my voice clipped. It's your mother, my dad's voice said, almost as if he were trying to shield her from my anticipated reaction. I waited in silence, and after a moment, she took the phone. Honey, Mom began, her voice trembling. We need to talk. About everything. I cut her off before she could launch into her prepared speech. Do you even realize what you're asking? I said, my anger bubbling to the surface. You took everything from me, my inheritance, my trust, and now you want me to save you? My mom's sharp intake of breath was followed by a choking sob. We made mistakes, she admitted, her voice cracking. We didn't handle things the way we should have. But we're still your parents. Doesn't that mean anything to you? Her words hit me like a physical blow, but not in the way she intended. They didn't spark guilt or sympathy, they sparked fury. After everything they had done, they were still trying to leverage their title as parents to absolve themselves of responsibility. I let out a bitter laugh. Does it mean anything to me? Let's think about that. You stole from me. You dismissed me. You made me feel like I didn't matter for my entire life. And now, you're coming to me because you've burned through every other option? No, Mom. It doesn't mean anything to me. She started crying again, but I suspected it was more about guilt than genuine remorse. I could picture her sitting there, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, hoping her tears would soften me like they always had with Grace. But I wasn't Grace. I wasn't going to fold. We never meant to hurt you, she said through sobs. You've always been so strong, so independent. We thought you didn't need us the way Grace did. That line, that excuse was the one that broke me. Do you have any idea how hard I worked to be independent? I snapped. You pushed me into that role because I didn't have a choice. You gave everything to Grace and left me to figure things out on my own. And now you expect me to bail you out? There was silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment, I wondered if they'd hung up. Then my dad's voice cut through the tension. We're sorry, kiddo, he said softly. We really are. But we're desperate. We don't know what else to do. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing. A part of me, a small, deeply buried part, wanted to give in. They were my parents after all. But then I thought about the years I had spent chasing their love and approval, only to be overlooked time and time again. No, I said firmly. It doesn't. I hung up, my hands shaking. For a long time, I sat there in silence, staring at my phone and wondering if I had done the right thing. But as the minutes ticked by, the anger in my chest began to settle into something else. Resolve. I had spent my whole life bending over backward for them, trying to earn their respect, their love. But they had made their choice, and now I was making mine. This time, I was choosing myself. It didn't take long for the fallout from my decision to ripple through the family. Grace wasted no time spinning the story in her favor, painting herself as the dutiful daughter who had done everything she could while I, the selfish and ungrateful twin, refused to step up in our parents' time of need. Word spread fast. Within days, my phone lit up with messages from cousins, aunts, and even distant relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. Some were thinly veiled attempts to guilt-trip me. "I can't believe you're leaving your parents to struggle like this," one cousin wrote. "They raised you, and this is how you repay them." Others weren't even trying to be subtle. "Wow, I didn't think you were so cold-hearted," an aunt texted. "You should be ashamed of yourself." One message from a second cousin I barely knew stood out. "So, you're holding a grudge just to spite Grace? That's petty, even for you." I didn't respond to any of them. What was the point? They weren't interested in hearing my side of the story. Grace had made sure of that. She told them a version of events that cast her as the long-suffering angel and me as the bitter, vengeful sister who refused to help out of sheer spite. It stung, of course. No one had bothered to ask why I'd made the decision I did. No one seemed to care about the years of favoritism, the stolen wedding fund, or the countless times my parents had treated me like an afterthought. They only saw my refusal to help and jumped to conclusions. For years, I'd kept my head down, swallowing my resentment to avoid rocking the boat. Now that I had finally stood up for myself, I was the villain. But as much as the backlash hurt, it also came with a strange sense of freedom. For the first time, I wasn't trying to explain myself or justify my actions to anyone. I didn't care what my extended family thought of me. They hadn't been there for the years of emotional neglect, the constant favoritism, or the betrayal that had pushed me to cut ties in the first place. Grace could say whatever she wanted. She could play the victim and bask in the family sympathy. I wasn't going to let her, or anyone else, pull me back into the toxic cycle I had spent so long escaping. Instead, I focused on the positives. I had a successful career, a supportive circle of friends, and a life that was finally mine. No guilt trips, no manipulation, no constant comparison to Grace. They could call me selfish. They could call me ungrateful. They could think whatever they wanted. I didn't care. For the first time, I felt truly free. Every now and then, in the quiet moments, the doubt crept in. Cutting off your family wasn't a decision you made lightly, no matter how justified it felt at the time. I would sit alone in my apartment on a Sunday evening or scroll through photos of other people's family gatherings on social media, and the thought would flicker across my mind. What if I'd handled things differently? It wasn't the memories of Grace that triggered the pangs of doubt. It was the idea of family itself. I missed the concept more than the reality. I missed the fantasy of reconciliation, of sitting down with my parents and Grace, hashing everything out, and somehow rebuilding what had been broken. In those moments, I let myself imagine an alternate universe where my parents had treated me with fairness and love, where Grace had been a sister instead of a rival, and where we could support each other instead of tearing each other down. But those moments of nostalgia were fleeting. They would pass as quickly as they came, chased away by the harsh reality of what my family had actually been like. When the doubt lingered longer than usual, I'd remind myself of the facts, how they had treated me for years, how they had dismissed me, ignored me, and taken from me without remorse. My parents had stolen my wedding fund, money my grandmother had explicitly set aside for me, and then had the audacity to act like they were entitled to my help. Grace had mocked my pain, trivializing the betrayal as if I was being unreasonable for wanting what was rightfully mine. If they had cared about me, truly cared, they would have treated me differently. They wouldn't have waited until they were in desperate need to reach out. They wouldn't have dismissed my achievements or made excuses for their blatant favoritism. No, their pleas for help weren't about love or family. They were about convenience. I was their last resort, the backup plan they never thought they'd need. And when I refused to play that role, they turned on me, painting me as the villain to anyone who would listen. The truth was I didn't regret my decision, not really. The peace I'd found in cutting them off far outweighed the guilt or doubt that occasionally crept in. For the first time, I wasn't bending over backward for people who didn't appreciate me. I wasn't spending my energy on toxic relationships or trying to win the approval of people who had already made it clear where their loyalties lay. Still, there was a sadness that lingered. Not for what I'd lost, but for what had never been there in the first place. I didn't miss my parents or Grace. I missed the idea of what they could have been. That distinction was what gave me clarity. I hadn't walked away from a loving family or a supportive sister. I'd walked away from years of neglect and manipulation. And while some people might see that as harsh or unforgiving, I saw it as choosing myself for the first time. Relief and regret often coexisted in those moments, but one thing remained certain. I didn't owe them anything. Not anymore. Months have passed since I last heard from my parents or Grace. The calls and messages that once bombarded my phone have stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I don't know if they've managed to pay off their medical bills, and honestly, I don't want to know. Whatever happens to them is no longer my concern. I've made my decision, and I'm sticking to it. There are nights, though, when the weight of it all creeps in. In the quiet hours, when the city hums softly outside my window, I find myself wondering, will I regret this someday? Will there come a time when I look back and wish I'd done things differently? That I'd forgiven them, helped them, tried harder to mend the bridge they set on fire? The answer doesn't come easily. It changes with my mood, with the ebb and flow of memory and emotion. On some nights, I feel a deep sense of liberation, a lightness I'd never known when I was tethered to their expectations and manipulations. On others, I feel the ghost of loss, not for the family I had, but for the one I never did. I've thrown myself into building a life I can be proud of. My career is thriving, and I've surrounded myself with people who see my worth and treat me with the respect I never got from my family. I've picked up hobbies I love, photography, hiking, painting, and they fill the spaces where doubt and sadness used to linger. But there's no denying that cutting ties with your family isn't as simple as walking away. It leaves a scar, a reminder that something fundamental went wrong. I've learned to live with that scar, to accept that some wounds don't fully heal, but instead become part of who you are. Whether or not my family ever sees what they did to me, whether or not they ever understand why I walked away, doesn't matter anymore. I've finally learned to value myself, and that's something they can never take away. And yet, there's a part of me that knows the story isn't over. Life has a way of circling back, of forcing you to confront the things you thought you'd left behind. Maybe they'll reach out again. Maybe Grace will have a change of heart, or maybe she won't. I don't know what the future holds, and I'm okay with that. For now, I'm focusing on myself, on building a life where I'm no longer the afterthought. A life where I come first, where my happiness isn't tied to their approval or forgiveness. Only time will tell if I'll look back with regret or with peace. For now, though, I'm choosing to move forward on my terms in my own way. That's all I can do.